Hi, I'm Emily. Welcome to or back to my channel. I hope you're having a really great start to 2025 so far. I am very excited to be back here for my first video of the new year. And for this video, I'm actually going to be recapping all of the best books I read in 2024. I've got 10 books and I'm going to go through them. I'm a university student at Cambridge studying creative writing, so I am doing a lot of reading all the time, and some of it is academic, some of it's for my dissertation that I'm working on at the moment, and some of it is just for fun, which has been the kind of stuff I've been reading during the holidays. But to kind of recap it all in my top 10 is a challenging thing because there's so many good books, and these 10 are the books that have kind of left the most lasting impact on me and been the most memorable. I have some of them in person with me, but some are on Kindle. Also, let me know what you've been reading this holiday season. If there's anything that you've been loving lately, let me know. I'm always looking for new book recommendations and you guys always come through with the best ones, so I'd love to hear in the comments below. Okay, to begin, so I've got My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, and my God, last year, I became the biggest Elena Ferrante fan, and I can't believe it took me this long to come around to that. It's really strange, actually. I can't understand why I never read this earlier. Very, very, very happy I finally got around to it. Yeah, I can't stop talking about it. Every one of my friends, everyone in my family knows that I love Elena. My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante is definitely my #1 read of the last year. However, I also read The Story of a New Name, and then Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, and The Story of a Lost Child. So they're all 4 different books, but for the sake of this video, we're going to put them together, and I actually am going to make a whole Elena Ferrante book video just dedicated to her. So that's why I'm going to kind of keep these together. But I will say Story of a New Name and My Brilliant Friend are my favorites. New York Times did this ranking of the 100 top books in the first quarter of the century. Interestingly enough, My Brilliant Friend got ranked as #1, and this was a ranking done through critics and authors and literary professionals, and they voted for their top books, and that was #1. So I knew about that as I was reading the first book, and I can definitely see why, but it also surprises me in the most wonderful way. But obviously every ranking is very arbitrary, but still it's interesting. They're about Lila and Lenu, 2 young girls and then women who are living in Naples in this book, and it starts in the 60s, I'm pretty sure, it starts in the 50s, the book, and then we go through to the last book and it spans 5 decades or so. So we start when they're about 8 years old and then we end when they're in their 60s. So that's a pretty massive scale of a story. But most of all, what's so interesting in that is that while it's this big story that spans many decades, it's so personal, so intimate, and so detailed. I don't know if I know of another author who is as intricate in her study of character than Elena Ferrante, and particularly of female characters, which I love. So, I mean, that's so right up my alley in terms of what I'm interested in literature and in stories. So I'm not surprised that I love this book, but I would really recommend this to anyone to pick up at least the first one and read it. And then I watched the HBO series, and that was really good too. So there's a season for every book. I don't want to say too much here and spoil it, but as I said, I'm going to make a whole video and I'll go through each of the 4 books. But if I had a book club, this would be my first pick for the book club. And I just think she manages with such dexterity and nuance what it is to be a human and to be in relationship with other people. And she intricately weaves these stories together. And I'm really, really impressed by her writing and just amazed and so, I guess, in awe of her skill as a novelist. When I did the video where my friends and I at Cambridge did a recommendation each, I recommended In the Margins by Elena Ferrante, which I don't have here, but that's my second book recommendation. I was such a fan of her writing from then, but that was the first book of hers I read earlier this year. And I really, really was taken aback with how she kind of talked about literature and talked about being a female writer and what it meant to kind of find her voice and how she did that. So that book is separated into 4 or so essays, I think, and is very inspiring for anybody who aspires to write, and so I highly recommend that one. Next is The Third Love by Hiromi Kawakami. I read it a few months ago, but it's still been kind of like echoing in my mind. I find myself thinking about it again, especially in the sense of how Kawakami played with timelines and setting. So I really love how she moves between modern Japan to Japan in the 17th century and then in the late Middle Ages. I thought it was pretty well woven, and I thought it was just a really smooth read. And again, a really interesting study of character. Riko is the main character, and she's in a marriage that's feeling a bit trapping, and she comes to the realization that she can travel in time through her dreams. So at nighttime, when she goes to sleep, she ends up in these two alternate time periods. We go through one first and then the other, and she lives through these two other characters that are also kind of her as well. She gets to play out two very different roles that are designated for women, and gets to almost study gender through her dreams and through moving in different time periods. And it's really fascinating, and then she kind of applies a lot of that back to her own life in modern times. And I think the author had some very intriguing concepts that she played with in this book. I do also think The Third Love isn't necessarily the best title for this book. It's kind of misleading because I didn't find it so much a love story. I found it more of like a self-discovery story, and I really, really liked that. The next book is After Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz. This is a really interesting one. It actually won Guardian Book of the Year, Independent Book of the Year, and a bunch of other awards. It's a very creative and academic novel in the sense of a lot of research you can tell has gone into this, and I find those kind of books interesting when pulled off well. And I have mixed feelings about this book, but it's definitely remained with me. Like, it's definitely one that I remember. I think that the back of this book is a little bit misleading as well, because it goes into the lives of a few different women, but you don't kind of understand the scope of this book, which is that it goes through so many characters that are based on real life women, which I think is a very challenging feat and a very intricate weaving of like fiction and non-fiction, and of just the sheer amount of characters as well. The one unifying force of this book is that it's based on female characters, female historical creatives. So it goes from people like Virginia Woolf to Eleanor Deuce, Gertrude Stein, Colette, Sarah Bernhardt, Isadora Duncan. So many interesting characters here, some that I was introduced to for the first time, which I really enjoyed. And then there's some of my favorite people in there. So it was just interesting to see how they were portrayed. So she kind of manages the sheer amount of content by focusing a little bit closer on certain characters and weaving them through different time periods. There's particularly in the late 1800s into early 1900s, and on the back it just says, "These are just a few of the women sharing the pages of a book as fierce as it is luminous, lush and poetic, furious and funny. After Sappho is a novel that celebrates the female trailblazers of the past, and one that also offers hope for our present and our future." And it's a really interesting book in terms of playing with timeline and character. Worth the read, and it's definitely stayed with me. And I really, really liked some of the segments in particular where there was like gathering of women of these different creators where they did meet in real life, and she kind of imagines what that may have been like. And she also has done a lot of research and read a lot from that time, a lot of diaries and a lot of the works that these women have all created. There's a massive exploration of being a female artist, whether that be as a visual artist or a writer or an actor, dancer, and I love that kind of theme, and that exploration of those topics is really, really interesting to me. So I definitely enjoyed that read. I've been reading so much during the holidays, so I am going to continue with that. However, I've realized I need to get back into writing, and I'm working on my dissertation right now, which is actually due this year. Now that the new year's come along, I realize I have a lot to do. I've been working steadily on my dissertation, but it's now kind of coming down closer to crunch time, at least for me, because I want to be done with full drafts earlier rather than later. I definitely want to keep reading as well, and I am reading for that, but also for fun and just my own interests. This video wouldn't be complete without mentioning this book, which was actually one of the books that really distracted me earlier this year. I was writing an essay and all I wanted to do was read this book. So it's Bunny by Mona Awad. I was so drawn to the title, to the pink, and I was not let down. It's definitely one of the more fun books that I read of the year. Also a very strange, weird, wacky concept, and I really enjoyed that. I do like reading books that not necessarily take you out of the ordinary world, but that do something different and that make an effort to be creative and imaginative. I like when I feel like the author has a really kind of distinct voice and distinct concept, and that's definitely true in Bunny. I haven't read any of her other books yet, but I definitely want to. Bunny is so iconic in terms of 2024 to me. I probably won't be able to think of this year without thinking of that book, because it's about Samantha, who is in a MFA creative writing program. I read it while I was at my creative writing masters, and that book and the program, to me, it's a linked thing, and I really enjoyed the exploration of characters and how she merged horror with fairy tale with contemporary literary fiction. This is the type of book I would read again. And Samantha is surrounded by some very intriguing characters, and she's in the fiction cohort with 4 other women, and the way they explore like the relationship between the 5 of them is really interesting. It's definitely a book I have recommended to a lot of people, and one that I have so much fun talking about, and one that you guys have commented about too quite a lot. It's one of those books that you remember, that's for sure. That's something that everybody says who's read this book. I'm really a big fan of fairy tales, so I like the emphasis on taking something that we know, which is a university and a university town, and then adding another kind of lens to it through almost distorting it into fairy tale land. And in terms of that, it's more of a horror kind of fairy tale. It's not inviting in that way. Mona Awad in her PhD studied fairy tales, but particularly she studied fear in fairy tales. So you can see how she really hones in on that in this book. And the way she creates this sense of horror and sinister quality is very interesting and strange and unique. And so I enjoyed that. And there's also a lot of fairy tale references without referencing only one. So it's not an adaptation. It's definitely an amalgamation of a lot of what she studied and researched, and then her own experiences and stories that she wants to tell. And I really find that very interesting way to approach writing. So the next book is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, and this one interests me in terms of like the book itself, but also how it interacts with current pop culture. If you've watched Saltburn and also Talented Mr. Ripley, Saltburn in particular, they both definitely refer to Brideshead Revisited in different ways. I found watching both those movies and reading this book this year was an interesting study of that type of character and that archetype, which in this book, this one's the first. So this was written during World War II when Evelyn Waugh was injured, and so he wrote this during 1943 and 44. It was like a nostalgic book for him, looking back on his days in Oxford and then beyond that, but obviously fiction. So it's partly based on his own life, but also not. And the character is Charles Ryder, who we kind of follow throughout this book, and he becomes very taken with the Marchmain family, and he becomes really enamoured by Sebastian, the son, when they study at Oxford together. Then he gets taken into the fold of their home and invited to Brideshead, which is this big country estate, and meets the rest of the family, and a lot unfolds there, and all these kind of entanglements happen, and this spans quite a bit of time. Like it goes forward into when he gets older. In some ways it's a bleak novel, in other ways, he had a nostalgia for a time that was more lavish and luxurious, and plays with those ideas in this book and really emphasizes that kind of world and draws a picture of it. I would say most of these characters are pretty unlikable. It's just left at that. Like, it's not trying to prove that these people are likable or anything, and I found that an interesting character study as well. Charles himself, the protagonist, I did not really like, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy reading the book. So I find that interesting because I've been thinking a lot about characters and unlikable characters and likable characters, but I also think there's a grey area and a blurred area where nobody is all likable and nobody is all unlikable, and I think that's what Elena Ferrante does really well and depicts so beautifully, that kind of grey area of morality and how you can't so easily box people into these traits, and that they can surprise you, and that things change, and that nothing is so simple or clear. But Brideshead has a very interesting take on character. Another book that will stay with me from the last year is Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf. And I am a big Virginia Woolf fan. I have always been. I remember reading Room of One's Own when I was like 15, and it's really stuck with me. So that would be in my top 10 of all time. But for this last year, Jacob's Room is a novel. It's, I think, her first novel, and it was very experimental in her eyes and in the eyes of critics and readers. I really like that experimental approach. It's about Jacob, who is a Cambridge student to begin with, and then he leaves Cambridge, has a different kind of life after that, like quite a different kind of life. And in some ways, there's similarities to Brideshead, but it's so different, and it's interesting reading it told through Virginia Woolf's eyes, considering her brother went to Cambridge. So part of this is based on him, I think, because women weren't allowed to earn degrees there when she was in her time, which is just shocking. She wrote this book, and I'm really interested in the fact that this was like her first novel that she wrote, and this was the first story she wanted to tell in novel form. And I remember reading it and being very kind of drawn in, and so it was really interesting to just read about these places that I've actually been to. I always love that in a book, when you can kind of layer it over your own knowledge of those places. So the next book is All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes by Maya Angelou, and she has a 7-book series that is her autobiography, and this is the 5th book in that series, and I don't think you have to read them in order. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is part of that collection of books. This one was published in 1986, but the story of this part of her life takes place between 1962 and 1965, when Maya Angelou's in her 30s and living in Ghana with her son. It's a really brilliant book about culture and race and belonging and home and family. She just so deftly and expertly and deeply looks at these topics from a very, very personal view, and a very poetic. I mean, obviously, because she was a poet, her writing and prose is so rich and so beautiful to read, and just very, very poetic and lyrical. It just kind of flows off the page as you read it. It's such a joy and a pleasure to read her writing and her prose. I haven't read all 7 of the books yet, but definitely more of them are on my list. My sister is working her way through them all, and then I'll read them after her. And that was a memorable one. I think her way of writing about place, of writing about Ghana and the people that she was surrounded by during that time, and what it was like for her to be living in Africa for the first time, and the way she writes about living and finding a home in Ghana is really intricate. And I would highly, highly recommend this to anyone. It's not a very big read in terms of length, but it really feels like it is, because she just goes so deep into the topics that she is exploring. That was a recommendation from my sister, and it was a very good one. So the next one is Girl by Camille Laurent. She is a French writer, so this was written in French, translated into English. It feels very autofictional to me, and I did talk about this earlier in the year. It's quite a big story in terms of like how it spans a lot of years. It starts in 1959 and then goes way, way, way into the 2000s. And it follows the life of one woman who is Laurence. She is born in 1959, and then we read as she gets older. We see her experiences of being a girl, being a young woman, and then a full adult woman, and a mother, and then we read about her daughter. And so it's quite a long spanning story. Not super long novel again though. So basically Laurent at first is living in Rouen in France, and we read about girlhood at that time in the 60s and 70s, and then the kind of rights of women during that time too, and it's explored through looking at herself, her sister, her mother, and then later her daughter, and it's a generational story, and it's definitely stuck with me in terms of how she mixes the political and the personal. Also, that was something that stood out to me with Maya Angelou as well. Girl is a novel I really enjoyed. It's quite heavy, but it's well written, and it's not a book I've heard a lot of people talk about, and I stumbled across it and I bought it because I was like, I have to read this. And I was not disappointed, and I really, really like autofiction, and I love Bildungsroman, stories of like coming of age. Definitely recommend that if that's a kind of story that you are interested in too. This kind of review says it very well. They say, masterful in her analysis of the subtle and obvious ways women are undermined by a sexist society, Camille lays out her experiences of the past 40 years in this poignant, powerful book. Girl is at once intimate and sweeping in its depiction of the great challenges we face, such as equalizing the education system and transmitting feminist values to the younger generations. I think that that book does that, and I think because it again is quite personal and very intimate, it has a lot of power in that. And people who can do that well, going back to Elena Ferrante, people that I very much admire, because it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that, and also a lot of skill. So that's definitely a theme amongst like Maya Angelou, Elena Ferrante and Camille Laurent, to go into that very intimate, personal, vulnerable place and be able to distill your story in such detail with such depth, knowing how to balance it all. One non-novel that I want to include on this list is a screenplay, and it's Past Lives by Celine Song. And if you've seen that movie and you loved it, then I would definitely recommend reading the screenplay. When I watched the movie for the first time last year, it was for sure on my top of the year film list. And I decided to read the screenplay. I am writing a screenplay at the moment for my dissertation, so I've been reading a lot of screenplays and watching a lot of movies. When I read that, I was so brought into the world. I'd seen the movie months before, and then I read the screenplay and I could just picture everything. And it was also written in a really unique way, as in it felt, again, very lyrical and very much distilled of an emotional quality on the page, which I think is really hard to do in screenwriting. I know she was a playwright before being a screenwriter. I think she's a very talented writer, and she explores relationships amongst characters, but also the character's own self so well. And that's not easy to do. It's such a delicate story and such a layered story of love, but also selfhood, and also belonging and home, and also the beauty of this film and the story is that it has multiple ways to approach it, where as a viewer and as a reader, where you can like focus on the love story and the kind of challenges between those three characters. It's also really a story about Nora and her loss of a part of her like self and her child self, and her reconnecting back to that, and that's really beautifully portrayed in the film but also in the script. I just remember being really drawn into the script, just as I was with the film, and like the opening and the ending is just so brilliant, and I just truly think that's a perfect movie, but it's also a perfect script. Okay, so I think that's actually the end of this video. I thought I had more books, but I realized I've done 10 now. So that is the end of my recap of my top books from 2024 in terms of memorable quality. And I'm also very, very excited to start reading new books. Well, I've been reading so much in the time between Christmas and New Year. It's always my like heightened time of reading, and I'm getting back into writing too, so that's exciting. I hope you guys are all having a lovely festive time and that you're having a great start to 2025. I am so excited to be filming more this year. Thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed and liked and commented during 2024, so make sure to like and subscribe and to leave a comment and tell me what you've been reading and loving during this holiday period.